Finally, UPSC has come up with its official answer key of CSAT 2024. Let's get to the bottom of each question and those keywords contained in each question. Let's explore how UPSC would assert its own keyword with its own official answer key. Let's get started with question number 1. Please pause and attempt. Question 1. I hope you read this. What's the question? Which of the following statements best reflect the most logical and rational inference that can be made from the passage? Inference is like a conclusion, something that you will draw directly from the passage. So it has to be surely from the passage. Look at statement 1. The current methods of food distribution are solely responsible for the loss and wastage of food. Solely responsible, solely. Now that is an extreme word. Solely responsible means the only reason why there is loss and wastage of food is because of these current methods of food distribution. Now we can't blame entirely the current methods of food distribution for the loss and wastage of food, and that is actually from the passage. Inferring from the passage. Remember, it's inference. And this word solely, an extreme word which I have to eliminate. So according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, 1/3 of food produced for human consumption, fine, is lost. That's about 1/3. And what about the rest? That's preserved, but not quite. Food is lost or wasted throughout the supply chain. That is also there. But the increasing wastage also results in land degradation by 45%, mainly due to deforestation, unsustainable agricultural practices, and excessive groundwater extraction. There are many more reasons mentioned which pertains to the loss and wastage of food. So solely responsible this distribution? No, that cannot be my answer. Yes, so statement 1 is eliminated, which makes it this an easy elimination. Option A is eliminated, option C is eliminated, option D is eliminated, which because it contains statement 1. Now looking at statement 2 can be inferred from this passage. Yes, land productivity is adversely affected by the prevailing trend of food loss and wastage, because there's a connection that is mentioned here. Wastage results in land degradation, so that's the connect. Right? So the connection is very clearly mentioned there. So statement 2 can be taken as an inference. And statement 3, yes, that can be taken. Reduction in loss and wastage of food results in lesser carbon footprint. Where do you get that from? This part. Decay also leads to harmful emissions of other gases in the atmosphere. So if you reduce the loss of food, there'll be lesser decay, and that would mean that there'll be lesser carbon footprint. That's the connect there. So that's something that you comprehend, infer from this passage. Looking at statement 4, that was an elimination. Okay, the statement 4 is already eliminated, but let me read it for the sake of reading. Post-harvest technology never mentioned here, to prevent or reduce the loss and wastage of food are not available. Who said that? This passage didn't say that. Right, and that's not inference from this passage for sure. So, rightly so, statement 4 is an easy statement to discard. Option B is my answer. I hope this is clear. Going to the next question, which is sub-question of this passage. Question number 2. Based on the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. Like I always say, assumption is a tricky keyword. There's always a limit till which you can assume. There's a level beyond which you cannot assume. Let's check for statement 1. The food distribution mechanism needs to be reimagined and made effective to reduce the loss and wastage of food. Well, this passage primarily focuses on the loss and wastage of food, its impact on environment and human beings. There's a lot many things mentioned in this passage which reaffirms that statement 1 can be assumed from this passage. There are a lot many things that need change, from household consumption, deforestation, agriculture practices which are not sustainable, groundwater extraction, a lot many things. So things need a good change, and yes, statement 1 can be assumed from this passage, and rightly said by the UPSC key. Statement 2. Ensuring the reduction of wastage and loss of food is social and moral responsibility of all citizens. Now, I may tend to not take this because of the fact that all is an extreme word. Citizen, people can be other than citizens also, not just classified as citizens, can be residents also, residing somewhere. But then the keyword is assumption. And when you have read this passage, there's no harm with this all being extreme because this passage pertains to so many things, starting from household consumption, where people are responsible morally, deforestation, unsustainable agricultural practices, groundwater extraction, people are morally and socially responsible there. And then loss and wastage of food in all forms is critical to complete the cycle of food sufficiency and food sustainability. So food has to be sufficient, has to be sustainable, and it's not just the food, it's the food cycle and where people are involved. So I can assume this also from this passage, which carries a good message too. So my answer is option C. Passage 2, certainly a passage that wouldn't interest those who are not that interested in economics. We'll have to deal with this no matter what. Question number 3. Which of the following statements best reflects the most logical and rational inferences that can be made from the passage? So we need to check for inference or inferences coming out from this passage. Let's look at each statement. Statement 1. Central banks cannot bring down inflation without budgetary backing. This cannot looks extreme, but if you really comprehend this passage, if you really understand this passage, that extreme is not an extreme this time for us to eliminate. Rightly said by UPSC in its official answer key 2. This part, if you read, higher interest rates announced by central banks are supposed to help produce modest fiscal austerity. Yes. However, without the fiscal backup, monetary policy eventually loses traction, its effectiveness or traction. Higher interest rates become inflationary. Well, this would mean it implies central banks cannot bring down inflation without budgetary backing. So that's how it is inferred from this passage. Statement 1. Let's check for statement 2. Statement 2. The effects of monetary policy depend on the fiscal policies pursued by the government. Depends on? Seriously? Yes. From which part of this passage I'll get that? From this part. Now read that. Without the fiscal backup, monetary policy eventually loses traction, eventually loses its effectiveness without fiscal backup. Very clearly mentioned in the passage. And if you can read this, the risk of monetary unmooring is greater when public debt rises because interest rates become more important to budget deficits. So the passage clearly states that without the fiscal backup, monetary policy eventually loses traction as higher interest rates can lead to more borrowings by the government to pay for the rising debt service costs. Well, this indicates that the effectiveness of monetary policy is heavily influenced by the fiscal policies of the government. So this statement 2 can also be inferred from this passage, and that's why my answer is option C. Question number 4, which is a sub-question of passage 2. Based on above passage, the following assumptions have been made. The keyword is assumption. Statement 1. Fiscal policies of governments are solely responsible for higher prices. Solely. We'll surely have a problem with this word solely. This passage never suggests that fiscal policies are solely responsible for higher prices. Never in this passage. In fact, this passage discusses how government spending and fiscal policies interact with monetary policies and interest rates to impact inflation. That's what this passage discusses. And then on top of all that, the passage suggests how monetary policy also impacts inflation. If you look at these lines, higher interest rates become inflationary. So that's what this passage suggests. So we can't for sure assume this. Statement 2, higher prices do not affect the long-term government bonds. Long-term government bonds? This passage never mentions the impact or interaction between that to long-term government bonds and higher prices. So this is too out of context to be taken as an assumption. So statement 2 cannot be taken. So rightly so, my answer is option D. Question 11. Which one of the following statements best reflects the most logical and rational inference that can be made from the above passage? The keyword here is inference. Let's agree to this. The language of this passage is set bit tough, especially with certain words very difficult to decode. For example, precincts. Precincts would mean an area that is designated for restricted or specific use, especially in town, which is closed to traffic. Well, there are these words which is making it difficult to infer something from this passage, but then there are easy eliminations that actually makes our work easy. That is also there. So once the passage is tough, the language is tough, UPSC always helps us with easy eliminations. For example, a passage like this. Now, let's look at all the options. Option A. Curriculum of urban planning courses should have diverse and interdisciplinary approach. Well, I would have read something like this from this passage. This was because of the very subject. So everything is connected with this was because of these very subjects were absorbed into the planning curriculum that had its roots in social sciences. So these things imply that curriculum for urban planning courses should have diverse and interdisciplinary approach. Well, let me check for other options. Option B. In India, city administration is under bureaucracy, which lacks formal training in urban planning and management. That's totally out of context. Just an easy elimination. An option given for sake of giving an option. Option B. Let's never mention something like that. The passage does not discuss bureaucracy or the lack of formal training in city administration. That's beyond the scope of the passage and cannot be a logical or rational inference for sure. Option C. In India, again in India, the management of urban areas is a local affair with a chronic problem of insufficient funds. There's nothing mentioned about funds here. Chronic problem, local affair. No, that's not what is mentioned in Indian context. Something mentioned in Indian context, yes. Planning in India and its education differ from the West. Just towards the end, Indian context is mentioned. That's it. And this is also an easy elimination. The passage being tough with this language, but elimination became very easy. Option D, with high density of population and widespread poverty in our urban areas, planned development in them is very difficult. Now, this looks like something which is true. It can be true, but then this truth should come from this passage. Then only it will inference from the passage. I cannot just, take something which sounds good, sounds true, looks okay, but it has to be coming from the passage. So this is not at all coming from this passage. While it may be true in general, high density and poverty make development in planning difficult. Well, this aspect is not specified in this passage. So again, that's beyond the scope of the passage. So I'm coming back to my option, my inclination, that is option A, and that is the UPSC official answer key also. So no problem with that inclination. Option A is the right answer. So the passage emphasizes the importance of systems approach to urban planning that factors in social, spatial, and cultural aspects. So they're all mentioned here. So that's my inference. Option A is my answer. Question 11. Which one of the following statements best reflects the most logical and rational inference that can be made from the above passage? The keyword here is inference. Let's agree to this. The language of this passage is set bit tough, especially with certain words very difficult to decode. For example, precincts. Precincts would mean an area that is designated for restricted or specific use, especially in town, which is closed to traffic. Well, there are these words which is making it difficult to infer something from this passage, but then there are easy eliminations that actually makes our work easy. That is also there. So once the passage is tough, the language is tough, UPSC always helps us with easy eliminations. For example, a passage like this. Now, let's look at all the options. Option A. Curriculum of urban planning courses should have diverse and interdisciplinary approach. Well, I would have read something like this from this passage. This was because of the very subject. So everything is connected with this was because of these very subjects were absorbed into the planning curriculum that had its roots in social sciences. So these things imply that curriculum for urban planning courses should have diverse and interdisciplinary approach. Well, let me check for other options. Option B. In India, city administration is under bureaucracy, which lacks formal training in urban planning and management. That's totally out of context. Just an easy elimination. An option given for sake of giving an option. Option B. Let's never mention something like that. The passage does not discuss bureaucracy or the lack of formal training in city administration. That's beyond the scope of the passage and cannot be a logical or rational inference for sure. Option C. In India, again in India, the management of urban areas is a local affair with a chronic problem of insufficient funds. There's nothing mentioned about funds here. Chronic problem, local affair. No, that's not what is mentioned in Indian context. Something mentioned in Indian context, yes. Planning in India and its education differ from the West. Just towards the end, Indian context is mentioned. That's it. And this is also an easy elimination. The passage being tough with its language, but elimination became very easy. Option D, with high density of population and widespread poverty in our urban areas, planned development in them is very difficult. Now, this looks like something which is true. It can be true, but then this truth should come from this passage. Then only it will inference from the passage. I cannot just, take something which sounds good, sounds true, looks okay, but it has to be coming from the passage. So this is not at all coming from this passage. While it may be true in general, high density and poverty make development in planning difficult. Well, this aspect is not specified in this passage. So again, that's beyond the scope of the passage. So I'm coming back to my option, my inclination, that is option A, and that is the UPSC official answer key also. So no problem with that inclination. Option A is the right answer. So the passage emphasizes the importance of systems approach to urban planning that factors in social, spatial, and cultural aspects. So they're all mentioned here. So that's my inference. Option A is my answer. Question 12. Based on the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. Statement 1. India needs a new generation of urban professionals with knowledge relevant to modern urban practice. That's something we can easily assume from this passage because the passage begins talking about today, if we consider cities such as New York, London, and Paris as some of the most iconic cities in the world, it is because plans carrying a heavy systems approach were imposed. And the passage goes on telling us the early universities of the West, which began to train professionals in planning, spawned some of the most ingenious planners who were experts in these domains. And then there's a mention towards the end regarding planning in India and its education differ from the West. So this passage has this assumption that we need a newer generation of urban professionals with knowledge relevant to modern urban practice. That's something that we can easily assume from this passage for sure. Now, going to statement 2, there's something that we can't assume. There's also a level limit till which we can assume. Indian universities, yes, there's something mentioned about in India, education differing from that from the West, but nothing about Indian universities as such. And that too, Indian universities at present having no capacity or potential to impart training. No, there is no blame of that sort put squarely on Indian universities. There's no capacity nor potential. This is also totally out of context in that sense. So my answer is option A. Question 13. Which one of the following statements best reflects the central idea of the passage? The keyword here is central idea. Option A. Constructed as a marketplace of views, social media ensures instant access to information. Seriously, that is not the central idea of this passage. This passage focus is not on the aspect of instant access to information. No, but rather on the influence of capital in amplifying voices. Well, look at this part. Capital can pay for more space for their opinions. They are effectively buying a louder voice. There's some skepticism regarding social media. There's something that we have to be taking care regarding social media. So that negative side, the skepticism is there mentioned in this passage. So this is not just about ensuring instant access to information. All right. So this is not the central idea of this passage for sure. Option B, social media are not ideal or moral institutions, but the products built by companies to make profits. That may look extreme, outrightly saying social media are not ideal or moral institutions. But if you have read this passage, the central idea looks like something like option B. But let me read further before reaffirming with this option. Option C, social media have been created to strengthen democracies. Well, it is never mentioned in this passage that social media is created to strengthen democracy. It's just mentioning about election, politics, all the things are mentioned here, but never in this passage it is mentioned that social media is created to strengthen democracies. So that cannot be your central idea, right? The passage suggests that social media can, put into danger the quality of political discourse. That's what the passage is telling, which contradicts the idea of strengthening democracies. So this is very clearly mentioned in this part. So that's not my answer, my central idea. Option D, in today's world, social media are inevitable for well-informed social life. Well, that's true. That's very much true. But then that truth is not coming from this passage. Then only that will become the central idea of the passage. So that is also not my answer. When I have eliminated option A, C, and D, what am I waiting for? Let me pick option B, which is my right answer. Yes, this passage is about the negative impact of social media on political discourse and the prioritization of profit over quality content. So that's what this passage is all about. So option B is my answer. In 14, which is the sub-question of the previous passage, based on the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. Statement 1, internet is not inclusive enough. That's something that can be easily assumed from this passage. At the very beginning, the passage talks, not every voice on the internet commands the same kind of audience. When anonymous private entities with high capital can pay for more space for their opinions, they are effectively buying a louder voice. So very clearly, the passage is telling us internet is not something which is inclusive, or it is not inclusive enough. Statement 2, internet can adversely affect the quality of politics in a country. This word can is always a helping word. For assuming this can is definitely a helping word. So is it the reason why we should assume that? Not just that. Now look at this part. If political discourse in digital sphere is a matter of outshining one's opponent till the election is won, then the quality of politics suffers, is very clearly mentioned here. So internet can adversely affect the quality of politics in a country. That's also something that can be assumed from this passage. The passage suggests that the internet favors those with more resources. That's also there. And then the passage also mentions that the quality of politics can be adversely affected by internet. So option C is the answer. Okay, please read this passage to answer question 21. Question 21. Based on the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. Statement 1. For effective school education, parents have greater role than governments. Such a comparison is never made here. In fact, there's no mention regarding the role of parents. Of course, parents and children expect that such graduates from school will go on to high school and college. That is there. This passage is all about the lack of competency in basic education. There's something that we lack. There's something where we lag, but there's nothing mentioned like parents having greater role than government. There's nothing mentioned like this, totally out of context. So even if you're assuming, there should be some relation with the passage. So this is not to be taken as an assumption. Statement 2, school curriculum that conforms to today's requirement and is uniform for the entire country may address the issues brought about. Of course, there are so many issues that is brought about here. So school curriculum that conforms to today's requirements, that may be okay, but something that is uniform for the entire country is never mentioned here. On top of all that, the passage strictly discusses the lag, like I said, in basic academic competency, but never about the reason for the same. The passage is not addressing the reason for that. It cannot be assumed that a uniform curriculum across the country would address such an issue. Okay, so this is also totally out of the scope of the passage. So my answer is option D. Question 22, which is a sub question of the previous one. And what's the keyword? Central idea. Option A. Total eradication of poverty in the country will resolve the issue of underperformance of our school children. I have a serious issue with this word will, and I have a serious issue with this entire option A. Now, this passage talks about a lot of issues pertaining to basic education. But this passage is never mentioning about the reasons for the same. This passage nowhere mentions the reason for the fallout of academic competencies at basic level. But this option looks like a solution, and the reason is not mentioned here. So how can this solution be a part of central theme? Number one, this is not mentioned here, eradication of poverty. Number two, the reason is not mentioned here. So this solution is totally out of context because of that reason. And that is why this reason cannot be a part of the central idea. It has to be mentioned here. And top of that, the reason is not mentioned here to give a solution. So option A is definitely not my answer. Because of the same reason, option B is also eliminated. Monetary incentives to parents and teachers is a strategy to improve the children's academic performance. The issues are mentioned here, but not the reasons. The reasons are not mentioned here. So, how can a solution like this be a part of a keyword like central idea? The central idea should contain that. The central idea is not containing the reason why such things are happening, then how can some random solution mentioned in the option be a part of the central idea? So I hope you understand the connection. So this solution is not mentioned in the passage, and top of that, the reason is not mentioned here, and this is some random solution that will never be a part of the central idea. Central idea is the thread around which the passage revolves. It is not a solution. It may be some other keyword UPSC asks like practical implication, practical solution. That would be fine. Even message, that can be fine. I'm not saying that will be fine, that can be fine, but not for central idea. Option B is not my answer. This is out of context totally. Now I'll talk about option C. Let me talk about option D. I'll come back to option C. Option D is also an easy elimination because the keyword is central idea. I'm connecting this to the keyword central idea. And this option D, India is not going to take advantage of the demographic dividend unless some school pass outs go back to agriculture. This option D is against the spirit, against the essence of the very passage. And that is why that cannot be a part of the central idea. And look at this part of the passage where it's clearly mentioned hardly anyone wants to go back to agriculture. So that is a part and parcel of the passage. And this option D is against the spirit of the passage, against the central idea of the passage. So that will never reflect the central idea. Maybe it is not reflecting the central idea of the passage. Option D. Option C is my answer as UPSC is picked in its official answer key. And why option C is my answer? Now look at this public policy that is also not mentioned here if you want to eliminate based on that. But the central idea is exactly that. There's a public policy should ensure that competency and achievements of young people are aligned with their expectations. Now look at these parts about compulsory education, compulsory schooling. Now, talking about expectations, parents and children expect that graduates from school will go on to high school and college. And towards the end, most importantly, connecting this, abilities in terms of academic competencies are far lower. So that's agreed by the passage. It's far lower than they should have. They should be even based on curriculum expectations of class 8. So there need to be a change. So that's mentioned here. So the passage clearly states all this. So this disconnect between expectations and so these two things are actually disconnecting the expectations and actual academic abilities, suggesting there's a need for policies that bridge this gap, aligning competencies with expectations. There's a need for policies to bridge this gap, aligning competencies with expectations. So option C is the central idea of this passage. Read this passage to answer question 23. Which one of the following statements best reflects the thinking of the author about these signs? This question is very specific on the very thought of the author with regards to science. What the author thinks about science. So very specific. Before I get to the options, Let me try to get the essence of the passage. At the very beginning, it's mentioned here, we take it for granted now that science has a social responsibility. And somewhere down the line, the author has mentioned social enterprise. Science is a social enterprise. Well, why do I say that we take it for granted? If I'm the author, why do I say we take it for granted now that science has a social responsibility? So when I say we take it for granted, I mean to say that science has a social responsibility. We can't be taking it for granted, right? Though we take it like that. It is not true. Science has a social responsibility. That's what I am trying to really assert. Going to the options now. Science must value the commitment of scientists. Now, that is not what the author thinks about science. It's not about that science is not valuing the commitment of scientists. No. If the author mentioned that science is not valuing the commitment of scientists, that would be fine. Then it would be fine to say science must value. But there's nothing mentioned in this passage that science is not valuing. So you can't take science must value. It's totally out of context. So I can't take option A. That's not what author thinks about science. Option B, science is a product of civilized society, fine, and must be used for the promotion of scientific awareness in people. Nowhere in this passage it is mentioned of that sort that science must be used for promotion of scientific awareness in people. This is not about the lack of scientific awareness, and science is something that should be using itself to promote scientific awareness. So that's not something the author thinks about science from this passage. So this is also out of context when it must be used for scientific awareness in people, must extreme word, people extreme. And anyway, that's also totally out of context. Option C, Industrial Revolution was made possible by the advancements in science. Now, this statement is a factual one that scientific advancements, achievements did play a role in enabling industrial revolution. That's quite factual. However, the passage does not focus on this relationship, but rather on how the concept of science social responsibility emerged around the time of industrial revolution. Therein comes industrial revolution. Why? That is why it is mentioned. How the concept of science social responsibility emerged during that time. Therefore, this statement, though it's true, is not directly relevant to the specific point the author is trying to make. It's not regarding what the author thinks about science. It's not a specific point. And option D is my answer, and rightly so picked by UPSC in its official key. Now, why would option D be right? Science must pursue truth but be responsible for social welfare. Now, this statement, this very statement, option D, if you're taking that as a statement, this option, this reflects the author's view as given in this passage, the essence of the passage, because it gives a kind of relationship, the dual relationship of science that the author describes here. Number one, pursuing truth, as in the times of Newton and Galileo. And number two, also being responsible for social welfare as a modern perspective that emerged around the time of Industrial Revolution. So this clearly captures the author's thought, author's take on science. So option D is rightly my answer. Read this passage to answer question 31. Question 31. Which one of the following is emphatically conveyed by the author of the passage? Emphatically conveyed, something new. Question 1. Without science, mankind could not have continued to exist till today. Well, that's an extreme statement. Nowhere mentioned here that science is the only reason why mankind could exist till today. Not mentioned here. Totally out of context. And I can emphatically discard, eliminate option 1. Statement 2, it is the science, it is the science that will, I have a problem with this will, ultimately determine the destiny of mankind. That's too much. Okay, so science is everything, determining ultimately the destiny of mankind. That's too extreme. Never mentioned this passage. So that's also easily eliminated. So two extreme statements out of context, wild, wide, out of context, no, not in the scope. So easy reasons why I'm picking option D. That's my answer. As asserted by UPSC also, option D is the answer. Now let me throw some light on what this passage is about and why such statements are easy eliminations. Yes, certainly, this passage talks about the relation between science and mankind. The history of science is the real history of mankind, and goes on to say the relation between science and mankind. And then the passage tells that science and mankind cannot be divorced from time to time at men's convenience. That's why. And ending with a rhetoric, thought provoking statement: is this the inevitable result of the progress of science, or does the fault lie elsewhere? That's just a rhetoric to end with. So while the passage does discuss the significant impact of science on human history and civilization, it does not claim that science will determine mankind's destiny. It raises a question about the allegations against the role of science in societal conflicts, indicating that the relation between science and mankind's destiny is complex and possibly influenced by other factors. That's it, but not these two extreme fact sentences. So option D is my answer. Going to the next question, which is a sub question of this passage. Question 32. Read this. Based on the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. The keyword assumption. Statement 1. The horrors of modern life are the inevitable result of the progress of science. Horrors, I've read somewhere. Progress of science, I've read somewhere. And this is how UPSC traps you. When I've read that, it's horrors of war. Yeah, it's horrors of modern life. Now, these two things are not the same. Horrors of war and horrors of modern life, these two are not the same. And progress of science, it's mentioned here in this statement. And where is it mentioned in this passage? This part. Now, what's the context? Yet we have seen that, in spite of countless opportunities of improvement, the opening years of the present period of civilization have been dominated by international conflict. Is this the inevitable? This international conflict, is it? This rhetoric a question asked, a thought-provoking question asked, is this international conflict the result, the inevitable result of progress of science, or the fault lies somewhere? So the author is not just telling that it can be just about the progress of science, there can be some other reason too for these international conflicts. But from this, the horrors of modern life is totally out of context in that case. Just that every words are mixed together to confuse us. Nowhere related to this part of the passage. It's about international conflicts, and that too, the author is asking us whether there's some other reason other than this progress of science. And what is this statement? The horrors of modern life are the inevitable results of progress of science. So this is actually reaffirming, asserting that whatever horrors are there in the modern life, that's because of progress of science. That's not mentioned in this passage like that. That's not mentioned. It's a confirmation here, but it's a rhetoric question asked along with some other reason that is possible. So clear case of elimination. Now looking at our statement 2, which is true according to UPSC. So let me try to throw light on why UPSC would take it as the right answer. So option B is the right answer. So now why option B? The aspect of truth likely to be overlooked is that science is what man has made it. Likely can be a helping word, but let me just focus on things in hand. Now, these things, look at this, some abstract third party. Okay, science and mankind cannot be divorced, these things. Now, the passage reflects on how science and mankind cannot be divorced at convenience and points out that treating science as an abstract entity separate from human agency is misleading. You see, this supports the assumption that the overlooked truth is that science is indeed shaped by human actions and decisions. So, everything, all this aligns well with the passage's idea, the essence of emphasizing there's a connection of science and human, this connection. So, that's why option B is my answer. Question 33. When we meet other people while we travel, we learn to differentiate between. There are 4 options given. Let me try to get the essence of this passage. Only with long experience and opening of his wares on many a beach where his language is not spoken will the merchant come to know the worth of what he carries. Value, the worth of one carries. It's only with long experience of opening, and this will, he, the person, is talked about. and the person who's commuting, who's traveling, and the art of learning fundamental common values is perhaps the greatest gain of travel. So these things are very clearly mentioned here. So this passage does not directly discuss the contrast between imagination and understanding. No, that is not. It focuses more on the realization of what values are universal and those which are localized. To understand better certain values through travel and interaction. Therefore, this option is not my thing to take. Option B, communities and nationalities. Not just about knowing people, others, other communities. It's about one's own self realization, own values, reflecting upon the self. That is also there. So it's not just about others, other communities or nationalities that you'll get to know that. You'll know your worth, your values too. You'll discover that. You'll rediscover that also. That is also clearly reflected in this passage. Although the passage mentions about encountering various cultures on many a beach where his language is not spoken, it's mentioned here, it does not focus on differentiating between communities and nationalities. Instead, the passage is about understanding the essence of the common values irrespective of geographical or cultural boundaries. The common values, that is also there. Again, the focus is on values, right? And local values and universal values, yes, this is actually my answer. Friends and foes, no. Then you know who your friends are, who will know your foes are. That is not it. There's nothing like that mentioned here. So option D is my answer. Definitely option C. So thinking about the local universal values, such delicate goods as justice, love and honor, courtesy, and indeed all the things we care for are valid everywhere. So these are some universal values talked about, and some local values mentioned here would be, but they are variously molded and often differently handled, and sometimes nearly unrecognizable if you meet them in a foreign land. This is about the local value that is mentioned here. So option C is my answer. So we'll get to the next one. Question 34, which is a sub question of the previous question. With reference to the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. Statement 1. Travel leads to an understanding of humans. Can that be assumed? Certainly, yes. It's all about understanding people, traveling, choices, common values, foreign land, right? Long experience, meeting people, art of learning. So that's something that can be easily assumed from this passage. In fact, that contains the essence of this passage. Statement 2, travel helps those who wish to learn fundamental common values. Certainly, yes. Travel helps. The common values are mentioned here, the local values, the universal values, as we got from the previous question. Yes, travel certainly helps. Statement 3, a person with long experience in travel can resolve differences amongst people. That's not mentioned here. That somebody who travels around the world, that person can resolve differences. That's not mentioned. That person can be experienced. That person will learn a lot. That is there. But that doesn't mean that the passage is never giving any hint that that person who travels around the world, travels too much, can resolve differences amongst people. No, he will learn, she will learn a lot. That's it, but not resolving differences. So option A is my. Read this passage to answer question 41. Which of the following statements best reflect the inferences that can be made from the passage? The keyword here is inference. Statement 1. In conventional classroom learning, the central goal is duration of learning rather than attainment of competency. Can this be inferred from this passage? Certainly, yes, this can be inferred from this passage. Which part? The passage all throughout contains its essence. Same set of lectures, same way, same duration, fixed duration, repeating the same ineffectual script in the realm of skill education. So this is the entirety of this passage regarding conventional classroom learning, which is doing all that. So that's something that can be easily inferred from this passage. So this part. Now going to statement 2, conventional classrooms encourage one-size-fits-all approach and stamp out all differentiation. You may think that these are all extremes, but this is clearly the essence of this passage. This is something mentioned regarding the issue regarding the conventional classrooms, which is encouraging one-size-fits-all. Because this passage talks this as the tyranny of classroom is that every learner is subject to the same set of lectures. In the end, a few learners shine, some survive, and the rest are left behind. What a trauma that is. So this is clearly mentioned here, repeating the same ineffectual script in the realm of skill education that will all pertain to statement 2 that can be inferred. So my answer is option C. Read this passage to answer question 41. Which of the following statements best reflect the inferences that can be made from the passage? The keyword here is inference. Statement 1. In conventional classroom learning, the central goal is duration of learning rather than attainment of competency. Can this be inferred from this passage? Certainly, yes, this can be inferred from this passage. Which part? The passage all throughout contains its essence. Same set of lectures, same way, same duration, fixed duration, repeating the same ineffectual script in the realm of skill education. So, this is the entirety of this passage regarding conventional classroom learning, which is doing all that. So, that's something that can be easily inferred from this passage. So, this part. Now, going to statement 2. Conventional classrooms encourage one size fits all approach and stamp out all differentiation. You may think that these are all extremes, but this is clearly the essence of this passage. This is something mentioned regarding the issue regarding the conventional classrooms, which is encouraging one size fits all. Because this passage talks this as the tyranny of classroom is that every learner is subject to the same set of lectures. In the end, a few learners shine, some survive, and the rest are left behind. What a trauma that is. So this is clearly mentioned here, repeating the same ineffectual script in the realm of skill education that will all pertain to statement 2 that can be inferred. So my answer is option C. Number 42, which is a sub-question of the previous passage. Based on the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. So the keyword here is assumption. Statement 1. As a large number of workers in our country are employed in unorganized sector, where does all this come from? India does not need to change its present conventional classroom system of education. Seriously? If India does not need to change its present conventional classroom system of education, then why did you tell all this? So this is not something that can be assumed from this passage. If this is the case, then why this passage? So this is an easy elimination. Even with its present conventional classroom system of education, India produces sufficient number of skilled workers to fully realize the benefits of demographic dividend. Now, 42 is a gift from UPSC to take your 2.5. This is never to be assumed from this passage. If these things can be assumed from this passage, that itself makes this passage invalid. There's no need for this passage. Author would really will feel bad if you will assume such things from this passage. Or they never meant all that. Option D is an Question 43. Based on the above passage, the following assumptions have been made. The keyword is assumption. Statement 1. The adolescent does not feel comfortable with his parents because they tend to be dominating and assertive. Can I assume this from this passage? The keyword assumption always gives me some freedom to assume if that is something that can be taken or assumed from the passage for sure. Yes, certainly yes. Now look at this passage. It's got all this. When child reaches adolescence, there's an apt to be a conflict between parents. The parental solicitude means concern or care, which is often a disguise for love of power. That is what the passage is telling. Not just the care, not just the concern, it's a disguise of love of power. The options they express, however, are so dogmatic, so much theoretical, not pragmatic, that the young seldom confide in them and usually go their own way in secret. So they don't take their parents as their confidante, they don't confide anything in them, and they go in their own way. This is what the passage is telling. Yes, this is something that can be assumed from the passage, for sure. Statement 2. The adolescent of modern times does not have much respect for parents. That's something totally out of context. So that's why that can be easily eliminated. Assumption has also some limit. So I can't assume that. There's nothing mentioned regarding the adolescent of modern times not having any respect for parents. That's not in the passage. Cannot be assumed at all. So option A is my question 44. Which one of the following statements best reflects the central idea of the passage? The keyword here is central idea. Option A. Parents in general may not be of much help when children are on their way to becoming adults. This may is a helping word. Well, after reading this passage, I feel this is the central theme for sure. Because the passage talks about when a child reaches adolescence, there's an apt to be a conflict between parents and child, since the latter considers himself to be now quite capable. And the passage expresses this, the options they express, however, are so dogmatic that young seldom confide in them. So a lot many things like that mentioned in this passage, making me believe is the central idea. But there are other options. Let me go through that. Option B. When children reach adolescence, involvement of parents in their lives is unnecessary. That's too absolute. That is totally out of context. That's never mentioned here. There's a limit, right? So you can't take that. Absolutely unnecessary. No, that's never mentioned like that. It's unnecessary. So there's some option that can be easily discarded. Option C, modern day nuclear families are not capable of bringing up children properly. Seriously, is the passage talking about nuclear families? The statement, the very statement, option C, is extreme and not supported by the passage. The passage is quite general and makes no mention or specification of modern nuclear or any particular type of family structure where this pattern is observed. So, well, this is an easy elimination. Option D, in modern societies, adolescents tend to be stubborn, disobedient, and careless. Well, you would have read somewhere else, but not from this passage. Okay? Because the passage nowhere mentions about them being stubborn, adolescents tend to be disobedient and careless. The passage describes the behavior of secrecy as a reaction to their parents' attitudes, rather than inherently labeling them as stubborn, disobedient, and careless. So that's just a reaction from their side towards the parents' attitude towards them. So this is also not my answer. Option A is definitely my answer. Option A is supported by UPSC official answer key 2. Read this small passage to answer question 51. Which of the following statements best reflects the most logical, rational, and practical suggestion? Practical suggestion, that's the keyword, as implied by the passage. So we need a practical suggestion that to implied by the passage. Statement option A. It's a cheap and practical method to produce limestone at commercial level for building purposes. Well, this passage is all about limestone formation. I agree with that. But this passage is about science, scientific processes. There's nothing mentioned about commerce or the commercial aspects. Well, this passage doesn't support option A for sure. The passage focuses on chemical process and the transformation of carbon dioxide into stone. And nowhere mentions the cost factor or the feasibility of carrying out the process at commercial scale. That's not here. So that's not a practical suggestion too. Option B, this can be used as one of the methods of carbon sequestration. Well, that sounds like my practical suggestion. Let me read further, then I'll come back to this. Option C, basalt rock can be made a good source of calcium and magnesium minerals by this method. But this passage is all about limestone formation, not just about, or not much about basalt rock or source of being the source of calcium and magnesium minerals by any method. The passage mentions that acidic mixture of carbon dioxide and water. So this is where it comes from. Okay, and water, dissolved basaltic rocks, calcium and magnesium, and thereafter goes on to mention the formation of limestone. So that's where the focus is, rather than the extraction of these minerals from such rocks. So that's not the focus there. Therefore, the focus of the passage is on the limestone formation again, rather than the extraction of calcium and magnesium from such rocks. So that's not the focus, and that's definitely not my practical suggestion coming from this passage. Option D, good rock dissolving acid can be produced by mixing carbon dioxide and water. But there's no scientific data, evidence, nothing to prove this. Something like good rock dissolving acid can be produced. Who said that? Nowhere in this passage that's mentioned. So option D is an easy elimination. It's totally out of context. And yes, option B is my answer. And rightly so, this can be used as one of the methods of carbon sequestration. This can is a helping word. And the option is the best answer because it's the process described involves the entire passage in its entirety involves converting carbon dioxide into limestone, which implies a method of carbon sequestration. That's what it is, right? Carbon sequestration would mean capturing and storing of atmospheric carbon dioxide. The scientists noted that carbon dioxide was effectively converted into stone. So that was mentioned here. So option B is my answer. Read this passage to answer question 52. Question 52. Based on above passage, the following assumptions have been made. Statement 1. Giant icebergs have a bearing on primary productivity and food chains of Southern Ocean. After reading this passage, I strongly believe statement 1 can be assumed from this passage. The passage talks about phytoplankton productivity at ocean's surface. It talks about giant icebergs, which are responsible for storing up to 20% of carbon in Southern Ocean. and the researchers discovering that melting water from giant icebergs which contains iron and other nutrients support this growth, phytoplankton growth. Now, the passage states that the melting of water from the giant icebergs contains nutrients that support high levels of phytoplankton growth. And this phytoplankton is the food for the fish population, and therefore, I can clearly say that it has a bearing on the primary productivity and food chains of the Southern Ocean. That can be easily assumed from this. Statement 2, melting of giant icebergs can being a helping word for me, produce climate change effects and impact of world fisheries. Maybe the climate change effects may not be directly mentioned in this passage, but certainly melting of giant icebergs will have an impact on world fisheries for sure, as that is mentioned in this passage regarding melting of water from giant icebergs, which contains iron and other nutrients. And UPSC 2 picked option C as the right answer. So that means statement 1 and statement 2 can be assumed from this passage. Question 53. Which one of the following statements best reflects the most logical, rational, and practical message conveyed by the passage? So this keyword is message. Option A. Farmers can use caterpillars to feed on weeds in their crop fields, plantations. Farmers using caterpillars to feed on weeds. Is that mentioned here? Or is that a message given by the passage? Certainly not. The option is not supported by the passage. The passage discusses the caterpillars feeding on corn, not weeds. Remember, it's on corn, not weeds, and does not suggest using them for weed control. This is never mentioned by this passage. So, that's never the message coming from this passage. Option B, this finding can help in the development of clinically useful antimicrobial compounds. Antimicrobial compounds. Well, the passage mentions this, that the plant, they can induce the plant to turn off its defense against insect predators, that part is mentioned. And remember, it's plant response to pathogens. So it's plant response to pathogens. Therefore, the focus is on compounds that are specific to plants. Okay, the focus is on plants, the compounds specific to plants. So this is best reflected in option C. So we'll talk about option C, but certainly it's not option B. Option D, so I'll talk about option C, UPSC official answer key. Option C is the answer, but let me talk about option D first. Caterpillars can be genetically modified to be predators of other plant pests. Well, this is totally out of context. This is something that is never mentioned here, something like that. Don't go with that trap of can be being a helping word. No, this never helps. That's totally beyond the scope of this passage. Option C is the right answer. And why option C is the right answer? This finding can, okay, you have can here as a helping word, no problem, help in the development of organic, ecologically sustainable pesticides. Well, that is the practical message given by this passage. The option aligns well with this passage. The ability of caterpillars to turn off plant defenses using their frass suggests that the potential for developing new types of pesticides. So that is what is coming out from this. Okay, the potential of developing new types of pesticides that could be organic and ecologically sustainable. So this is actually the logical and practical message given by this passage. So option C is my right answer. Read this passage to answer question 61. Which one of the following statements best reflects the crux of the above passage? What's the keyword? The keyword here is crux. Option A. Responsible media should not distort the real in an ideal democracy. Now, this is clearly the crux of the passage. I would just want to pick A, but since there are other options to read, let me read that and come back to this. Because I've read this, I clearly know this is the crux. Reading further, checking for hopefully more eliminations. Fake news seems inherent in the life of an ideal democracy. Ideal democracy and fake news, this is not matching. Well, the statement, this very option B, contradicts the passage, which emphasizes the need for responsible media to avoid distortion, implying that fake news is not desirable or inherent in an ideal democracy. Further, there's no mention of fake news per se. And fake news is totally out of context in the first place. And this is against the spirit of the passage for sure. Fake news and ideal democracy not matching. Okay, there should not be any kind of restrictions on the freedom of expression in an ideal democracy. Well, there's nothing mentioned about freedom of expression or any sort of restrictions. So this also seems to be totally out of passage. So what is totally out of the context of the passage cannot be the crux of the passage. The passage does not discuss the freedom of expression. Its focus is on more accuracy and responsibility of the media in conveying reality rather than on the absence of restrictions. So that's not my crux of the passage. Option D, responsible media and political leaders cannot be effectively controlled in an ideal democracy. Well, there's nothing mentioned about irresponsible media and political leaders being controlled or not controlled in an ideal democracy. This also is beyond the scope of the passage. And yes, UPSC key also affirms option A is the right answer. Responsible media should not distort the real in an ideal democracy. The passage throughout discusses the importance of a responsible and transparent media. That's what the passage is discussing all throughout. A normatively responsible media through its communication effect. So these things are very clearly mentioned here. So option A is my answer. Read this passage to answer question 62. Which one of the following statements best reflects the most logical, rational, and practical message implied by the passage? So the keyword here is practical message. I read this passage. It's so scary, right? Nowadays, there's a growing trend to use interconnect home devices. The corporate, our home is being, converted into a corporate storefront. Quite scary. Now, let me read the options. Knowledge of consumer behavior leads to more capital expenditure in manufacturing sector. Anything for an option? That is totally out of context, and that's definitely not a message. Well, this statement does not, or this option does not directly address the main concern of the passage. There is a concern addressed in this passage very clearly. It's a huge concern, which are about data collection and privacy rather than just capital expenditure in manufacturing. It's just this passage is all about data privacy, data collection. That's what it's all about. So this is not my answer. Option B, knowledge of consumer behavior stimulates the growth of commerce and trade and thus helps in the overall economic development of the country. Very clearly out of context. Well, it is true that the knowledge of consumer behavior stimulates the growth of commerce. That's fine. The passage does not connect this to economic development or make any mention of it, and that to the development of the country. That is too much. It's too much, and that is outside the scope of this passage. Well, option C. Interconnected devices give a lot of comfort to home users and improve the overall quality of life. As though this passage is all about the advertisement of interconnected devices. Well, this passage is not advertising or being the champion of interconnected devices. Well, or that was a comfort that is easily eliminated. That's not an inference, and definitely that is not a message coming out from this passage. Although interconnected devices might provide comfort, the statement overloads the statement totally. This just discards the passage's emphasis on privacy and data misuse. That's the most important thing mentioned here. So this just totally negates that. Option D, amongst the given options, this statement, um, you know, this option D, that looks the best one. And that is actually the right answer according to UPSC key. Interconnect devices can is a helping word out there, be at security risk and home users may have privacy risk. So may is also used there, so not used will. So we can easily take that as a message. Well, that is something like an inference, but that is, as the keyword suggests, we are taking that as a message. So amongst the given options, this is the best one because the privacy and security risk associated with interconnected home devices is clearly mentioned in option D. To answer question 63. Question 63. Which one of the following statements best reflects the crux of the above passage? The keyword here is crux. Crux is the central theme around which the passage revolves. The main idea of this passage. That will be the crux. Well, looking at options, option A, environmental sustainability is inimical to our objective of achieving a higher rate of GDP growth. Now, straight away looks out of context, the higher rate of GDP growth and all that. Well, looking at the passage and reading all that, this option is not supported by this passage for sure. The passage suggests that environmental sustainability and economic growth should be pursued together through green growth strategies and not that they are opposed to each other. So, this is an easy elimination for me, not the crux of this passage. Looking to option B, looking at option B, poverty eradication is not possible without a rapid economic growth and the consequent environmental degradation. There's nothing mentioned of that sort that you can take this as a crux of this passage. The passage, on the contrary, what the passage says, that the sustainable development strategies will help avoid an economic dead end and ensure inclusive growth. So that is what the passage tells, not this. That's not the crux of this passage. Option C, according to UPSC answer key, option C is correct. I'll get to that. Let me just go about eliminating one more option and we'll get to the right answer. Option D, which is the wrong answer. With large populations, rampant poverty, and limited resources of today's world, environmental degradation cannot be prevented. Now, that's so pessimistic, so negative. There's nothing like environmental degradation cannot be prevented. That's extremely mentioned like that. That's out of context. And look at this, cannot be prevented, and inequalities are inevitable. There's nowhere in this passage, not even a single line or a phrase that will help us pick this thing. Inequalities are inevitable. There's nowhere mentioned in this passage. So that can never be a part of the crux of this passage. So coming to the right answer, which is option C, maintaining high environmental standards is now a prerequisite for achieving a steady, sufficient, and inclusive growth. That very much is the entirety of this passage, the crux of this passage. As you can read, resource intensive and in particular energy intensive processes will need to make way for more efficient and resource frugal development strategies. We are to avoid an economic dead end or a world in which only a small elite is able to enjoy affluence in the midst of a sea of poverty. Now, these things, as per the passage, so this option, option C, which is the right answer, clearly is set with the theme of the passage, which emphasizes the need for environmentally sustainable growth strategies to achieve inclusive growth and avoid economic and social disparities. So, option C is my answer. Which one of the following statements best reflects the most logical and rational message conveyed by the above passage? So, the keyword here is message. It is the poetry, not science or religion, which recognizes and accepts imperfections in humans. Imperfection, this word is used in the passage here. Truth usually does not admit to any contradictions or imperfections. So that's in that context, this word imperfection is used. So now you're reading it like this, you may get trapped. It's about truth that is not usually admitting any contradictions or imperfections. And poetry abides by the plurality of life and existence. Poetry follows reality, which is plural. That's all there. But now look at this imperfections in humans. But this different context where the truth is connected to contradictions and imperfections, the truth does not admit that. So this imperfections in humans seems to be something out of context. Let me read further. Let me see if I can get a better answer than option A. I may be sticking to option A now, but let me read further. If there are reasons to select this or not select this. Option B. Truth is revealed through science or religion and poetry is anatma to truth. Anatma, what do you mean by anatma? Anatma is something or someone which strongly dislikes. So poetry is disliking truth. Truth is disliking poetry. That is totally out of context. It's actually against the spirit of this passage. Right. While the passage discusses how poetry does not deal with absolute truths, yes, it does not suggest that poetry is an anatma to truth. It does not suggest that. Instead, it indicates that poetry operates within a different paradigm that values plurality and contradictions. So poetry totally operates in a different regime, different paradigm. Okay. So it's not about option B, that's for sure. Option C, Poetry is romantic, imaginary, is about feeling, whereas science and religion is about truth. Now, this is about the message of the passage. So, first of all, this passage is not about differentiating what poetry or religion or science is. It's not about that. It's not about trying to define, distinguish, or differentiate between that. If you're picking option C as a message, that would be a wrong option to pick. The passage does not emphasize poetry as a merely romantic or imaginary. That is also there. It focuses on the role of poetry in recognizing the plurality and contradictions of life rather than just thinking that it's romantic or imaginary, rather than categorizing it as a purely about feelings. It's not just about feelings, it's beyond feelings. That's what this passage is telling. So option C is just about poetry connected to feelings. So they'll be just limiting poetry in that context. The passage is never mentioned. So that's definitely not a message also from this passage. Don't limit that much poetry because the passage just talk too much about poetry, not just as a feeling. Option D, in a world of violence, tyranny, and bigotry, poetry is a form of dynamic resistance. Now, comparing A and D, I've got every possible reason to believe that D is my better answer. Now, why D is my better answer? Because look at the essence of this passage. Those forces or individuals who claim to have absolute truths in their grasp tend to turn dictatorial and tyrannical. Poetry abides by the plurality of life and existence, so therein poetry comes to help. And against the tyranny of truth, poetry remains a partisan of democratic reality. Again, poetry is coming to help. Okay, so in a world of violence, tyranny, and bigotry, poetry is a form of dynamic resistance. That's where poetry helps. So that's the message given by this passage. Against the arrogance of power, wealth, and hierarchy, poetry proposes both humility and defiance. Now, what more we need to pick option D? And UPSC said, pick option D, that's your 2.5. And yes, since I've picked option D, I cannot have two right answers. This is my wrong answer, and particularly because of these imperfections in humans and things are looking to be out of context. And definitely that is not a message from this passage. Option D is a clear-cut message. Going to the final question from set A of 2014, that's question number 72. Question 72. What is the keyword? Assumption. What a lovely passage. It's a beautiful passage. The flower was not invented to please us. It flaunted its petals and spread its perfume to attract an insect. The insect carries the pollen from flower to flower, so the pollen is not carried away by the wind and is not wasted. What a beautiful connection. The flower flaunting its petals and spreading its perfume. Why? To attract insect. And the insect carries pollen from flower to flower. Why? So the pollen is not carried away by wind and is not wasted. Now, looking at the options, the statements, the author of the passage believes that flowers are creations of nature's luxury. No, it's about some necessity, not luxury. The statement is totally against the spirit of this author, totally contradicting what the author is trying to tell us. The passage does not suggest that flowers are creations of nature's luxury. In fact, it emphasizes the role of flowers in attracting insects for pollination. The passage mentions in those parts which I've already mentioned, the role of flowers is very clearly mentioned. So, indicating that the flowers have a practical purpose rather than just being a luxurious creation, just to attract us. Now, we are getting attracted. Flowers please us. Why? Because we are conditioned to it. That's because of our conditioning and nothing more than that. That's what the author is telling in this passage. So, this is something that I cannot assume from this passage. Now, statement two. The author of the passage does not believe in the usefulness of flowers except as things of beauty. No, the author clearly believes in the usefulness of flowers, in the functional role of flowers, the role played by flowers. That's more important. Okay, so it's not just a thing of beauty. That is what the author is trying to portray here. So it's totally against the essence of this passage, statement 2 also. So my answer would be option D. As you can, the flower was not invented to please us. We have been conditioned to it. So this is a very clear, so my answer is option D.